Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Ideas and Imagination stream, part of WOTS 2020 online. We are so excited to bring you the second half of today's programming. But before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that WOTS Toronto operates on land that is the territory of the Huron-Wendat and Petun First Nations, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation. This territory is the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Confederacy of the Anishinaabeg and Allied Nations to care for and share the resources around the Great Lakes in peace. Tkaronto is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples with long histories on this land. We are privileged to live, work, and create in this territory and strive to act with awareness and solidarity. We encourage you to educate yourself about the land you occupy wherever you're tuning in from. You can find this out at www.native-land.ca. And now I am pleased to welcome Merry Medievalist and Dino Lover, Erin Sylvester. Hi there, Erin.
Hello.
Erin will be moderating our panel today. Erin is head of research at the Walrus. She will be moderating how to apply the fact-checking mindset. Erin's work has been published in the Ryerson Review of Journalism, Torontoist, and the Calgary Herald. We also have coming in with us Hamutal Dotan. Welcome.
Hello.
Hamutal edited long-form features for the Globe and Mail, commented on politics for the CBC, and led an online magazine to become the first to win a National Magazine Award without ever having issued a print edition. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Nicole Schmidt is a Berlin-based writer and fact-checker. Prior to joining the Walrus as the Power Corporation of Canada's Senior Fellow, she worked as the Arts and Culture Editor at Toronto Life. Her writing has appeared in Maclean's, The National Post, Yahoo, and Vice. Welcome, Nicole.
Thanks.
And then last but not least, we have Viviane Fairbank. Hello. Viviane is a writer and editor based in Montreal, formerly associate editor and head of research at the Walrus. I will leave you all to it. Have a wonderful time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, guys. So I am indeed the head of research at the Walrus. So usually I am the one lecturing everybody about fact-checking. So this is an absolutely lovely change of plans today where I get to make other people talk about fact-checking. So it is indeed what we are here to talk about today. So often when people think about fact-checking, especially these days, they kind of think about someone like Daniel Dale, who's taking statements from public figures and then sort of publicly assessing whether those statements are true, whether they're lacking context, or they think of a project like Snopes or PolitiFact, which is again like taking sort of published stories or statements and then assessing whether they're true, whether they lack context, whether they're misleading, and kind of assigning a label to them. So those are all ways of fact-checking, but magazines tend to do that a little bit differently. We do fact-checking behind the scenes. So we aren't taking, say, a writer's story and kind of posting it on our website with like red pen showing all the things that they got wrong or were out of context. So we're fixing it all up before it ever makes it to print. So all the audience sees is hopefully the cleaned up and corrected version. So today we're going to sort of peel back the curtain a little bit on what that looks like at the Walrus, and then let you see how we approach fact-checking, and then the ways that we can take the lessons from the fact-checking process at a magazine and sort of apply them to your own work. So that's what we're going to cover today. So my first question for the panelists is what makes a fact? And I'm maybe going to toss it over to Viviane first.
Thank you for that intro. Yeah, I guess, so there's no clear answer to this question, and I have obsessed about this question for way too long. But I think the conclusion I've come to is that for our purposes, a fact is anything that is verifiable in any kind of way. So it's like a much less reductive version of what a fact is than you might hear in other circles. But I usually tell writers, unless what you're writing only has to do with what is happening inside your own brain and doesn't affect anyone else at all, then it's a fact. And as soon as it has to do with the external world or with other people in some way, then it needs to be verified.
Thank you. Nicole, do you have anything to add?
I get to follow an answer like that. As someone who works with facts basically every single day, I have also spent a lot of time thinking about this. And I think In the plainest terms, of course, a fact is something that can be proven to be true, as Viviane said, backed up by credible sources. Those can look a little bit different. Sometimes we talk to experts, sometimes we're looking through journals, all of these sorts of things. And I guess the only thing that I wanted to add is that, a fact can differ from opinion, which may not be objectively true or false, but even opinions, which I think the wrongful assumption is that they kind of get let off the hook sometimes, they still must be supported by facts. So it all matters.
And I'm wondering if we could dig in a little bit to that, both in a way that kind of will explain how we do fact checking at a magazine. So when you say that opinions also need to be checked, how do we go about that, and why does it matter? And I want to make sure Hamutal also gets a chance to chat about fact checking.
Who wants to? Was this for me?
Sure, if you want to expand on that.
Okay, and feel free to jump in at any point, everyone else. But I think if anyone has an opinion that they feel strong enough that they want to put out into the world, it had to come from somewhere, right? It's usually shaped by reading something or a conversation that you had with someone. And an opinion isn't just built on that thing alone. There are things that have to stand up around it to support it. And I think when you're fact checking something like that, it can be your job to dig a little bit deeper, even beyond the opinion itself, and make sure that what we're putting into the world can hold up on its own and be questioned and still stand strong.
Yeah, I guess I would add that everyone has the right to their opinion, but as soon as you are getting it published, then you only have the right to your fact-based opinion.
I kind of want to jump off that because I know this is something actually that Hamutal and I have talked about before, which is as a fact checker, if you disagree, say, with a conclusion that a writer has drawn, or you feel that, the writer holds this opinion, but you've gone out and found sources, and you can draw a conclusion from those sources that's different from the one the writer drew, or sort of presents a counter argument in a way to the position the writer drew. What can you do with that, and how can we fact check and sort of present differing opinions to a writer while still respecting their chance to make new arguments and to sort of even be provocative? Do you want to take this one, Hamutal, to start off?
So I should start by saying that I've never been a fact checker. I've only been on the editing side of it. So bear with me and cut me, a little bit of slack for that. But I guess what I would, and you and I talk about this a lot, what I would say is that something can be factual but not truthful. And what I would add to sort of the first question about what makes a fact is that facts don't operate or work in isolation. Facts have context, and facts are part of the context for other statements. And it's possible for something to be factually correct when you look at a series of discrete statements, but to be very misleading in terms of what purpose you're putting those facts to. And a lot of the art of journalism and a lot of the art of editing is making selections that are fair amongst all of the facts, because you can't actually include every fact, because if you include every fact, you're just reproducing the entire world. When you're telling someone, oh, this is the story of Ruth Bader Ginsburg's funeral, or this is the story of Justin Trudeau's summer vacation, whatever story you're telling, you're choosing some things and not other things. And you need to be an honest broker. And the job of a fact checker, the job of a writer, the job of an editor in different ways is to be an honest broker between the universe that contains every single fact in the world and the story that an audience is going to get. And so I think if you're a checker and you can see that facts lead to a number of different possible conclusions or possible arguments, your job isn't to force the writer to be maximally inclusive. It's to almost be a proxy for the reader and understand what a reasonable interpretation of the facts is. And some of that might mean saying to the writer, okay, you're minimizing this line of thought that isn't convenient for you, but it's important. Some of it is recognizing, okay, yeah, there's this other stuff over here, but it's not actually proportionally all that significant. And that's not something that ever has a slam dunk answer. It is not a science. It happens in conversation. But that sense of proportionality is really what those conversations are about.
I see you nodding, Viviane. Did you want to say anything?
No, I mean, that was a really good way of putting it. I feel, I guess whenever I'm training fact checkers, when I was training fact checkers, I would always tell them, like, you're not trying to fix the story so that it's told as you would tell it. Like, there are a lot of different ways to tell a story, and there are a lot of factual ways to tell a story. But some part of the fact checker's responsibility is to make sure that every important perspective is included. So there's this aspect of like inclusion of different sources and perspectives that I think the fact checker can really ensure is happening.
I sort of want to talk about, you said, like, Hamutal, you were talking about, you know, your job as the fact checker is partially to sort of be a proxy for the reader and to think, like, what would a reasonable reader draw from this? And for better or for worse, that kind of reminds me of, in some way, the approach of like legal thinking, sort of assuming, like, you know, if you're the jury, like what would a reasonable person do, or like what is the reasonable way to think about this? And I know we've sort of talked about that too, like the potential framework that gives us for fact checking. Like, should we sort of approach this as, you know, in a more legal way, or should we, or is that like a limiting mode of thinking? If there's anything you want to add to that, I know that was a bit vague.
I mean, I guess what I'd say is that one of the really important pertinent differences for me is that in a courtroom, there's a very specifically defined scope. And it's not just that that's what the job of the trial is to examine, but it's that oftentimes jurors are precluded from hearing about things that are deemed to be out of the scope. They might be prejudicial or they might be irrelevant. And so they're specifically walled off from that information. And journalism is very different because readers aren't just reading your story separate from the rest of the world. And they will have a context, they will have other facts, they will have other stories. And so I think you can assume that readers for any given story will be reading other things about that same issue, and you can make some reasonable allowances for the framework and the context that gives them. So you don't need to start from square one in a piece of journalism in the way that you do in a courtroom, because you can assume some common basis of facts that are not included in the story, but that are well understood.
If I can add something, I also feel like the law includes a really helpful framework from the idea of like responsible journalism, which is like a part of Canadian law. I am not a legal expert, but like there is this kind of idea ingrained in the way that we talk about libel and communication, where like to be a responsible journalist is to actively try to engage with all the involved parties. And that serves as like a really helpful framework for, I think, what fact checking tries to do and what the reporter should try to do, because you want to be responsible in a way that the law has set out, which is like, if you're profiling someone, you have to reach out to them. You have to give everyone the chance to participate and be respected and involved. And like, that's a very helpful way of thinking about it, I think.
Yeah, and I also think, obviously, it's such a case-by-case scenario, in that sometimes you need to choose what's worth omitting and what might be worth adding in. To give an example, perhaps, of nothing horribly controversial at all, because those are maybe the easiest to understand, but I once checked a story about kombucha, and specifically I was trying to confirm this fact that kombucha could help cure hemorrhoids and anxiety, two like very random and unrelated things. And this always seems to be the case actually with research studies, is that one study will say something and there's often some study that says something else, conflicting information. And in a lot of cases, sometimes we give the reader all of the facts. So X study says this in brackets, but X study says this, and then they can kind of choose for themselves what they put together. But again, it is such a case-by-case basis.
And I think sort of jumping off that idea of inclusion and making sure both that we include sort of like all the relevant information about a detail that we have found, and we sort of get to determine what is relevant. And then also in terms of including the sources. So the way we do fact checking at the Walrus is that we go through every story line by line, and we sort of look for usually two sources to back up or support each detail in a story. So that includes looking for documentary sources, whether that's newspapers, magazines, scientific papers. And we also call back all of the sources that a writer spoke to. And we ask them usually like a big long list of yes or no questions about everything that's related to them in a piece, which gives them a chance to maybe respond to certain things or to correct certain things. And also just to sort of here is everything we're going to say about you. And so with that as the background, I'm wondering if we could talk a little bit about how we work with writers and sources through the process of fact checking, and maybe about how we can better support writers or sources through the process of fact checking. And this is sort of especially pertinent when we're dealing with stories that might be really sensitive. For example, like if we're checking a story about an assault or some other sort of traumatic incident. Do you want to start, Nicole? Not to put you on the spot.
No, I can start because again, this is what a lot of my day-to-day life looks like. And I guess from the perspective of a fact checker who is reaching out to sources, I think it's really important to be mindful of the fact that a lot of these sources, especially when we're dealing with more sensitive topics, aren't familiar with what a fact checking call looks like, what it involves, and what our role is in the whole thing. So I think it is really, really important to take the time to explain why you're getting in touch, the types of questions that you're going to be asking, and why it's important. And to circle back to, these slightly more difficult conversations that we often have with survivors or, family members who have lost their loved ones. It's also giving them time and space to make sure that we're getting their story right. So they know exactly what is going to be published. I think sometimes a fact-checking call can help with any pre-publication anxiety. And then in terms of ways that we can support them, I think it's really important just to think of how you would want to be spoken to if you were on the other end of that call. And a really important thing I think that we can do for survivors especially is, check in with them along the way to see how they're doing, offer to have a support person on the other end of the call, so that if they are needing a little extra support or feeling anxious, we are able to give that to them. And yeah, I think that kind of sums up supporting sources, but Viv, I don't know if you had anything else to add as someone who also did a lot of this type of work.
No, you said it very well. I think it really just takes conversations beforehand, and I think one of the ways that maybe the Walrus has shifted its practice over time is including kind of preemptive conversations more and more. We will often, if it's a sensitive story or if the source seems a little nervous, the first step is really for the reporter to establish that relationship regardless. And then part of the establishing of that relationship should be informed consent, which I know I use those words all the time, but for a source to agree to participate in a story means that they should know that participation includes being fact-checked. They should know what to expect. They should feel like we're respecting their wishes, and nothing should come as a surprise. So the fact-checking call should feel like a natural and actually helpful part of the process for them, and that just takes a case-by-case conversation about what they need. But then I think also working with editors as a fact checker and working with writers is a very particular skill. So, there's one relationship you establish with the source that's very important, and that's kind of the whole publication team working together to support the source. And then there's the fact checker and the way that they kind of interact with the writer and with the editor. I usually try to kind of advocate for a separation of church and state for the most part. So once the writer has given the fact checker all the information they need, the writer shouldn't actually be involved in the fact checking process. And the editor is really the one that facilitates all of these changes. So maybe Hamutal can talk about that, because Hamutal knows kind of how to mediate those conversations.
Yeah, so I have a little spiel that I tend to give, not necessarily in a planned way, but that because it comes up often enough when I'm working with a checker, and it tends to happen sort of quite often with people who are new to fact checking. And it has to do with the role of the fact checker is to be the literalist, right? What you were trained to do and what you are there to contribute to the process is to look in a very hard-headed, very, very concrete way at the words on a page, phrase by phrase and clause by clause, and to interrogate them. And not to interrogate them in an adversarial way, but in a sort of curious and skeptical way. And my job as an editor is to understand that readers aren't literalists. When I sit down to read a magazine article, when I sit down to read a novel, I'm not experiencing the words and the phrases the way that a fact checker is. And so my job is to take what they tell me and go back to that sort of uncomplicated reading experience and see how those two things line up. So sometimes a fact checker will say, well, you need to include this or that and the other, and then a sentence that had 2 clauses has 7 clauses because you're putting every last item in a series of, she went to the store to buy some milk, but oh, she also bought some bread, and she also bought some jam, and she also bought some coffee, and oh, by the way, there were coffee filters too. And it's like, okay, that's all true, but does it matter for the purposes of what this sentence is doing in the story? And I think that's where you really sort of get a division of labor. And sometimes it's hard for me as an editor to sort of help a fact checker reassume that sort of naive role of a reader. And it's something that I harp on a lot because readers aren't literalists. And I think we need to have enough respect for readers to understand what's going on when they look at a sentence or a paragraph. But nobody likes having their sentences interrogated. And I also need to not get defensive in a way that a writer will get defensive. And it's like, oh, wait, you told me I had 5 facts in the sentence and 4 of them were wrong. And I'm going to get my backup as an editor, just because it's human nature, just in the same way as a writer does. Nicole is laughing. I might have gotten my backup with her. Not entirely sure. And so it's a balancing act. On one hand, you've got your sort of pretty good grasp of what a sort of naive reading of a sentence looks like. And on the other hand, you've got all of the natural human psychology, and you need to find your middle ground.
There's much to talk about in there. So feel free to jump in, Viviane or Nicole, if that has sparked any thoughts for you. One of the things that I also wanted to sort of bring up is the idea of how we assess sources, which is a little bit different than what we were just talking about, but is also obviously related to like the whole process of fact checking and the process of deciding which information is important. So I think it can be true. And we sort of talk about the different definition between like being virtually certain about something and being checking sure. I talk about that a lot. So being virtually certain of something can mean like you're pretty sure that it's true. You've heard people say it. It's often believed or commonly repeated. And then being checking sure usually means I have done the legwork. I have looked into this. I have sources that I can produce on demand that help support this statement. So there is a difference between those two things. And I just in sort of the practicalities of doing the research, I wonder like how do we assess sources, and how do we avoid sort of falling into the trap of just repeating something that has become often repeated. One of the examples that I have of this, I will not call out any specific publications, but I know who you are, is that it has become a little bit trendy these days to say something like the Black Death in Europe in the Middle Ages ended feudalism or created the nation state or led to the conditions that ended feudalism in Europe or created the nation state. I won't go into all of the reasons that that is not true, but it is not, for many reasons that many medieval experts would be happy to talk about. So I'll cut myself off there, but I wonder if you guys could talk about, how we sort of avoid falling into those traps.
And I can start, and feel free to take over at any point, anyone. But for a little bit of insight into like Walrus standards and kind of how we do fact checking, typically it's minimum 2 sources to confirm a fact. So just because one source says something is true, we would not take that as, you know, to be a fact. We need it to be confirmed elsewhere. And I think another trap sometimes that is easy to fall into is just because X person says something means it's true. And maybe if we call them on the phone and verify that the quote is accurate, yes, they said that, check, it doesn't mean that the information within the quote is correct. Oftentimes I run into this with people wrongly citing scientific studies or statistics that they maybe heard and kind of remembered somewhere. And I think it's just really important to be critical of, yes, one, what people are saying, and 2, making sure that there is enough supporting evidence elsewhere to support what we're claiming.
I don't know if we're going to talk about this maybe later on, so we don't have to talk about it too much, but I also think that you have to understand the context in which you're trying to verify a fact, or the kind of documentation that would be available, or when you're talking to someone where they're coming from. So some experts can talk about their field, but they can't talk about their colleagues' field, which I feel like academics often try to do. They're like, you know, they talk about adjacent things and it kind of balloons over, and then you realize at a certain point, actually, this is not the right expert to be speaking to about this. And so it's good to kind of be critical about who you consider an expert. But there are also kind of like broader considerations, like if you're fact checking something that has to do with the First Nation, there might not be the documentation as you want there to be. And so having kind of really strict restrictions on what counts as verification, what kinds of hard facts you need, can actually be quite exclusive. So there is kind of like this constant conversation you need to be having with yourself as a fact checker as to what kind of standards is appropriate for this fact, and that might change.
Yeah, sorry, I was just like nodding enthusiastically. So I'm also curious to talk a little bit about how fact-checking changes when you're working with fiction versus nonfiction. We do a little bit of both at the magazine, and I know Word on the Street also does a little bit of both. So Viviane, maybe you could start us off, because I think Nicole said you've never actually checked fiction.
No, you guys always give me the like cult stories and murder stories and no fiction for me.
Yeah, I feel like I always have like funny, half angry conversations with fiction authors where like, I hear you fact check fiction. But it does kind of make sense when you think about it. So of course, fiction is about the author kind of creating a world for themselves. And of course, that world might not reflect the real world, and that's completely fine. But I think fact checkers actually can help a lot, because often you want your world to be consistent in itself. And sometimes when you're writing fiction, you kind of accidentally forget something. Or sometimes you want parts of it to reflect real life. So you set your story in Toronto. If you spell the street name wrong, either that's something you're doing on purpose because you're making fun of Toronto street names, or that's actually a mistake that might confuse your readers. So I always kind of say, any mistake in a fiction story is allowed, but you want it to be a deliberate mistake, and the rest should kind of line up. But of course, unlike in a nonfiction, in fiction, the author always has final say. One of like the famous examples is when I was a fellow, I fact-checked a fiction story. And there was like a very particular scene of someone running down the beach in Cyprus and kind of looking up at the sky and seeing a particular constellation, and then looking down and seeing like baby turtles hatching, which like, I think at first I was like, there's nothing to check in here apart from the fact that turtles hatch sometimes. But then I started thinking about it more, and I was like, okay, if we want this to be consistent with the real world, then I have to confirm like, from that particular part of the beach, I can see these particular constellations at that particular time of year. And is that time of year the same time of year that turtles hatch? So then you have to do actually a lot of things where if you want it to be reflective of the real life, you got to do, I think it took me like hours of research for this scene.
And if I'm remembering the sort of conclusion of that correctly, it was like very unlikely that those two things would overlap, but it was intentional.
Yeah, well, the author was actually incredible because I think it was like, oh, there's only 1 week of the year that these two things line up. And I emailed him and I was just like, hey, like, I just wanted to be sure that this is what you meant, but like, of course, it's up to you. And he was like, here's a giant folder of research I've done to like precisely have this week be the week. So it was amazing.
I love that example. And it's also, it shows that details matter, whether you're writing fiction or nonfiction. So I would also love to talk about ways that fact-checking has maybe changed how each of you approach editing or writing, or whether it has changed how you approach those things. Do you want to start us off, Hamutal? Oh no, we lost her.
Oh no. I guess she didn't like the question.
Maybe she tried to unmute and accidentally left. Well, hopefully she will be able to come back. Oh, she's back.
There she is. Okay.
So sorry, no idea what happened there. Yeah, so what I would say is that it's something that primarily changes how I think about a story when I'm thinking about whether to accept a pitch. And most often it comes up in cases where someone is pitching a memoir or something that has some sort of first-person element to it. The Walrus has a very, very rigorous fact-checking process. Not all publications do. And not all writers actually understand what kind of fact-checking process they will be signing up for if they haven't written to us before, because they won't necessarily have experienced it somewhere else. And if you were pitching me a memoir that is in any way delicate or sensitive, if I'm going to need to have a fact checker make phone calls to other people in your life who you have complicated relationships with, if it's going to be a process that's difficult for you as a writer and more difficult than it otherwise would be because it's going through that process, it's not that I'll preemptively decide yes or no to take the story, but I'll talk to the writer about what that means a lot. And I'll almost do this thing where I'm trying to persuade them not to do it, just so they can be very, very sure that they do want to go ahead anyway. And sometimes it will absolutely change what a writer will include in a story. They'll say, okay, I don't want to go there. If you need to call my estranged parent, just no. Sometimes they will go ahead, but you definitely want to give them the autonomy to make those choices before they sign a contract and before you take them through a process, which is going to be emotionally and sometimes practically complicated. If you're writing about difficult things in your life, sometimes those will have very concrete ramifications the day after a story hits the stands. And so you want to be very respectful of that experience and what those consequences will be.
Do you want to take it from there, Viviane? Because I know you've sort of been on both sides in terms of like, you have actually all three sides. I don't know how many sides there are to this. You've fact-checked, you've edited for the Walrus, and you've written for the Walrus.
It definitely affects kind of, I think, everything I do, even outside of anything magazine related, in terms of learning, I guess, the right balance of skepticism. I think being too critical of everything and too skeptical of everything is just as counterproductive as kind of believing everything blindly. And finding that balance is definitely something that fact checking has taught me. I think Nicole probably feels the same way. Like, you can just identify red flags in the way that things are communicated so much quicker now. And I hear myself fact checking myself in conversation all the time. Like, I'm always saying, you know what, I'm gonna have to go look that up. I'm not sure. It definitely changes the way I edit. I think for the same reasons, there's like an instinct to kind of knowing, oh, this person is pitching something, but you know what, I actually am not seeing the kind of research that the fact checker would even need. And that's already kind of going to lead the conversation I have with the writer from the start. I think it's also made me like a lot more humble. I think I used to have this very rationalist idea of what facts were and how to check them. And then, and then you kind of join the industry and you start talking to people. And I think one of the things I really appreciate about the Walrus is how we try to make the fact-checking process really adaptive to different things. And that's something that also has changed in my writing and editing. I think we're like, if the main thing you're trying to do is be respectful of everyone, I think a really good tool for that is fact-checking. But main aim is still respect. And so you have to kind of use that tool in its best way always.
I'm going to get to you in a sec, Nicole, but I actually wonder, do you mind expanding a little bit on like what a red flag would look like how you know like something is a red flag in the way that something is being told or written?
I'm going to try to think of like here, a pet peeve I have all the time is like someone will send me a pitch about something. My thing is science, so it'll be like a science related thing. And they'll just say like, experts say this, and they won't have specified like who the experts are, in what context have they said this, like are there studies, is it just like you had a conversation with someone? And I find, I guess 95% of the time, that will obviously be a follow-up question for me. They either will never answer the email once I've asked that, or like they'll just be like, oh, well, it's just like common knowledge. And so the experts say is usually a very good cop-out from actually doing the necessary research. And if you have done it, usually you'll just write like, according to a 2015 study. And yeah, so I guess that's like I used to be like, experts said it. And now I'm like, no.
Do you want to take it away, Nicole?
Sure. Viviane, you made this funny point that resonates about catching yourself and often being like, I must go fact check the thing that I just said. And hilariously, I think I've traumatized my poor roommate because now she often prefaces the things that she says to me with, I haven't fact checked this, but I heard. And yeah, that's a little bit of a side tangent, but I think the shortest and sweetest way to sum it up is that it makes you more critical about how you think and question the types of sources that you're accessing, and what makes a good source. One more short example that I can give is I was checking a story once, and on this website that was very beautifully put together. It looked professional and like something that would have credible information. And when I went to the about section of the website, it literally had a disclaimer that was like, anything on this website might not actually be true. So like me. So yeah, just really thinking about where you're getting your information and how they know that information is true. Because something that Viviane taught me actually is that a lot of books aren't even fact-checked. That's something we often consider to be word, to be true, because it is printed. But that's often not the case. So yes, just think about how you actually know things, where they come from.
I think we are nearing the end of our time, but I actually just want to pick up on something you mentioned, Viviane, that I think we've touched on in different ways, but you described fact-checking as a way of sort of respecting everyone involved in the process. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about that and about how it is respectful.
I guess the easiest way of putting it is like, you aren't allowed to assume anything. And I think often disrespect comes from assumptions. So when you fact check something, you're forced to just ask everyone how they feel and whether they agree. And like, I think the act of being like, do you agree, is an important part of like what it means to respect someone before you publish something about them. And I guess also there's this humility in being like, okay, we don't actually know what the truth was, and we don't even always know how to find out what the truth is, and like being able to kind of internalize that and letting other people teach you something, like reaching out to someone and being like, I don't actually come from your community, I don't know the things you know, can you tell me about it? And like, can I defer to you in this way? So deferral is often a sign of respect as well.
Sorry, my cursor was floating around. Yeah, and I also think something that we talk about, especially with new checkers, is ways to approach fact checking that don't come across as combative. I'm not sure how successful that always is, because it can be sometimes kind of fun to be right about something. But I think that is something that we do talk about in the fact checking seminar when we train new fellows and new freelance checkers, is about how you are sort of taking apart a writer's work, and you should never assume that they meant to get things wrong. Like, you should never assume that they are like sloppy. You should assume that they are competent and tried their best and are humans and aren't approaching it the same way that you are. And so you are taking their story apart and putting it back together. But that's the key part, is that you have to put it back together together. And it has to be collaborative, and it should be a process where you're saying, we want to make sure that everything in your story that's going to have your name on it is something that all of us can really stand behind. I'm not always sure it feels like that to a writer. Hamutal, you're laughing.
Yeah. The psychology of this is a real phenomenon. And I think you're right. When you check something, like, everyone finds it gratifying to be correct. And so sometimes the psychodynamics can get a little bit adversarial because the checker thinks, aha, I figured something out. And the writer's like, why are you trying to undermine me? And the thing that, like, checkers are there to have your back as a writer. They're there to have your back as an editor. And sometimes that means I need to tell you some hard truths. This thing that you thought you were sure of is in fact incorrect. Oftentimes that means when you discover an error that is, I will say, more of a technical error or an honest misunderstanding, you're going to go do the legwork to figure out what needs to go in there. The study said 82%, you know, and it wasn't 79, but that's fine. And to do it in a way that is aware of and mindful of what the ultimate purpose of a story is. And while your job as a checker is to be a literalist, the more you understand what a story's purpose is and what it's driving at and why it's important, the better you'll actually be able to understand not just what a discrete fact is, but what role it's playing in the context of the story. And I think the more experience you have as a checker and sort of the better sort of trained you are, the more you don't just rest on, haha, I found this error on page 7 and it's supposed to be 82 and not 79, but actually are sort of working with the writer on the mission of whatever the story is.
We're all fellow travelers in this story. It's the attitude. Those are most of the things I really wanted to chat about today. But if there are any final thoughts, like if there's anything you want to share about, like a lesson that fact checking has taught you, or an example of a time that you think like fact checking something really like succeeded or like corrected a long-standing misunderstanding or this historical record. I often will harp on about this, about how even the small details matter, because if we repeat something that's like kind of true but not exactly true over and over, it becomes calcified into like the true narrative of how this thing happened. And then it is much harder to change people's ideas about something. I will stop myself.
My tidbit that I will end on is that if we're going to sum it up on a happy note, the thing that fact checking taught me, and that I'm really grateful for, is to question everything, and not in a cynical way, but especially in the types of media that you're consuming. Mostly because I've never checked a story where I haven't had at least one clarification or correction, and it makes me very, not skeptical, but wonder what is perhaps missing in publications that don't go ahead and fact check. So it really is an art, and I appreciate places that do it and do it well.
I guess it's worth saying it can also be really fun. I think we like take it really seriously because it is really important and very serious. But like sometimes, you know, you get these like goofy stories or these goofy corrections, or you just get to call people all over the world who have like crazy expertise in weird things. I was fact checking a book last month, and I had a long conversation with someone who studies specifically the smell of sweat and smells different people's armpits and talks about it. And like, I learned so much about the world, I think, and how to communicate and how to explore from this job. So it's also just like a pleasant time a lot of the time.
So again, I've never done fact checking. I've only been the beneficiary of it. So maybe I'm not actually entitled to answer this question, but it's very, very gratifying as an editor to be able to use fact checking to help you understand a world that isn't your world, and to do it well and to do it properly. And one of the things that sort of makes me really appreciate this is that we currently live in a world where there are a disproportionately small number of journalists who are writers of color, who are marginalized in various ways. And one of the things that means, and it means many things, but one of the things that means is that people from outside of certain communities need to do some of the journalistic work telling stories of those communities, because there are not enough of the right mixes of all of the representations that you would want. And something like fact checking helps you to do that in a way that's actually credible. And that's a very, very difficult thing to pull off. So one thing that we've sort of talked a lot about at the Walrus over the years and sort of shifted to is doing a lot of community reads. And that has really helped us, for instance, not just tell sort of what you want to call broadly Indigenous stories, but specific stories about specific nations and specific communities, and do it with an understanding of the traditions, of the geography, of the place where that story is. And it's because of the fact checking that we can even attempt to do that in a way that is responsible and isn't just an outsider coming in and not really understanding the world in which they're operating.
Thank you so much to everyone. This has been a really fascinating discussion. I've been so happy just kind of sitting in my back end perch and like learning all of these hard skills that are really useful for us in our age. I really hope that everyone who's watching can take these and start to sort of, soften all of the calcified knowledge that they have. It's incorrect, and maybe go do a little digging of their own. So thank you all so much. Thank you, Erin, Nicole, Hamutal, Viviane. It's been really wonderful to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much.
Of course. Another big thank you to our friends at the Walrus for partnering with us on this event. You can learn more about the Walrus or subscribe to the magazine at thewalrus.ca. Hamutal will return with us in about 15 minutes at 3:30 p.m. to moderate our next panel on the future of media and the public interest with David McKie, Anya-Milana Sulaver, and Kasia Mihailovich. We'll see you in just a little bit. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Ideas and Imagination stream on WOTS 2020. This is the future of media and the public interest, and I will be reintroducing to you our moderator for the panel, Hamutal Dotan. Hello there.
Hello, and hi everyone at home who I cannot see, but thank you for joining us.
Prior to joining the Walrus as a senior editor, Hamutal edited long-form features for the Globe and Mail, commented on politics for the CBC, and led an online magazine to become the first to win a National Magazine Award without ever having issued a print edition. Very excited to see the discussion that you line up for these folks.
Thank you so much, Santa. Public discourse in 2020 can seem like a hopeless wasteland full of empty platitudes, lies, exaggeration, gaslighting, and distortion. How have media organizations responded? What can journalists do to provide the depth and breadth of understanding that we all need for Canadian democracy to thrive? Joining us to discuss those issues are three journalists with a range of experiences and from a variety of outlets who all work on this question in various ways. David McKie is an award-winning journalist who spent 26 years as an investigative producer with the CBC. He is now the deputy managing editor of the National Observer and teaches journalism at Carleton University, the University of King's College, and Ryerson University. Kasia Mihailovic is an audio journalist, the host of the Cool Mules podcast, and senior producer of Canadaland. And Anya-Milana Sulaver's career spans 3 decades, featuring work as a documentary producer, filmmaker, and cultural analyst. She is the publisher and executive editor of Peeps magazine, which publishes ethically produced, engaging stories about people around the world. It looks like we are still just waiting for David to join us in just a minute, but we're going to get started. And we're going to get started by writing up a little bit of a report card on journalism in 2020. We hear a lot about misinformation and disinformation, about the erosion of democratic norms, about social media-fueled conspiracy theories, and so many other red flags. It's a confluence of factors that are both cause and effect of diminishing public trust in media. But I want to talk for a minute about how journalism itself is handling the state of affairs. So not everything that's happening elsewhere in the world, but what's happening in the industry itself. And I guess what I'm wondering is what each of you thinks about whether and how media is rising to the occasion and what ways in which media is failing. Kasia, do you want to start?
Sure, sorry. I think it's been a very confusing time for me personally and professionally. Something happened and we all had to figure out different ways of covering it. At Canadaland, where we do a lot of media criticism as well as kind of covering the news, we tried to find a personal connection in the isolation interviews that we had, where we were just talking to people about how they were dealing with the lockdown when it first happened. More broadly, I've seen a lot of disturbing trends as the industry took a huge hit. JSource has done really great reporting about how many journalism jobs have been lost during the pandemic just because advertisers don't have the same budgets that they used to. And despite the fact that we've been tightening our belts since I've been a journalist, we're doing it more. And now we're also covering a pandemic, many of us from home. I don't have a podcast studio in my house, but I do have a closet, and that's what we've been doing. So I almost think that I'm going to need another couple of years to process quite what has been happening in 2020, but I've seen a lot of great work from Jane Litvinenko at BuzzFeed about the kind of misinformation campaigns that are going on, from Emily Bell and the Tao Center for Journalism. She does great work with that. I always follow her. I used to work with her, and I've learned so much from that. And there's just, it seems quite relentless. And I don't know if anyone has a more coherent view of what's been happening, but sometimes I think we're doing so much with so little at this point. And then sometimes I see where we really have so much more work to go. And the an example of that is the way that journalists have been treated during various protests in Canada and the US. I'm thinking particularly of Carl Dockstader being arrested at 1492 Laneback Lane in Caledonia, and the ways I think we could come together more to support freedom of the press here and our ability to do our jobs without interference. And yeah, that's one example, but there's just a lot going on. Anya, do you have?
Yeah, thanks so much, Kasia. Your insight is awesome. And I have to clarify, we don't actually see ourselves as producing journalism at Peeps. We say slow journalism as a way of kind of expressing what we do, its value to the reader, because they're these in-depth researched and over long periods of time. But we would never, we actually think what journalism does is really important, and we're here to support journalism. And so our view on what's going on in terms of erosion of faith in media is a bit longer view, it's a bit higher view. And for us, it's a recognition that all institutions are currently, and the government, whether it's the media, whether it's, there are a wide variety, none of the, and the academy, let's face it, it's a big source for us. All of these things have lost an incredible amount of respect and trust over the course of the last 20 years. And I mean, I could go conspiracy theorist on you, or I could realistically say that I mean, depends on the day. But the reality is there are reasons for that distrust, and maybe kind of doubling back and looking at how those disconnects kind of came into being would put us in a position to be able to address how to create trust system-wide, to provide support across all of them, because I don't think anybody, whether it's a policymaker, a journalist, an academic, goes to work wanting to not do work for the better good, for the greater good, at least the vast majority of them. So at Peeps, what we're trying to do is create materials that bring those communities together and kind of create trust out of the collaboration between them.
Thank you so much. And David, glad that you were able to join us.
Thank you very much.
So what we've been chatting about is, given the very strange and distressing period that we live in, one where there is so much pressure from misinformation and disinformation and conspiracy theories and everything else that we know about, how do you think media is rising to the occasion successfully, and where do you think that it is falling short?
I think we're rising. I think Donald Trump is responsible for us rising to the occasion. All of a sudden, we become truth tellers. We are doing things ostensibly that we should have always been doing, which is fact checking on the fly. Whether it be when we have guests on our shows, for example, and you have producers in the background who are fact checking and feeding information to the host in real time. Or in our coverage, if there is an errant tweet or a fact, it is given context right away. And this has just become a way of doing things. So I think that, with the advent of the so-called, fake news or whatever you want to call it, I think that it has put a greater emphasis on us to fact check and do our due diligence. I don't really see too many downsides. To tell you the truth, I think that this, the ability to check facts and that really separates the real folks from the pretenders. Because in the past, anyone can call themselves a journalist, but not anyone is in a position to challenge so-called facts that authorities may be giving out or may be presenting as real news. So I think that it is, there's a reason that an organization like the New York Times is doing very well right now and is very trusted. So I think that, in an age of fake news, I think that what you'll probably see is a lot of organizations, outfits, branding themselves as the real deal. You can trust us. And I think that that's doubly so in the age of COVID. That has just reinforced the need to have reliable data, to have it quickly, and to have it dispensed by not necessarily politicians, but public health officials, people whose Hippocratic oath is to do no harm under any circumstances. So I think that this is a really, I mean, maybe I'm being naive, but I think this is a really good opportunity, and I think that we as journalists have to embrace this as such. We've got to take it and run with it as hard as we can.
I just want to follow up on one thing that you said, David, which is that Trump was making journalists do something that they hadn't done before.
I said hadn't done ostensibly, right? I mean, I wouldn't want to suggest that journalists never check their facts, but it was never an in-your-face exercise, right? It was like, well, but it was never out there on like for everyone to see and drawing attention to it.
And so I guess what I'm wondering is, why weren't we? And is it better that we are, or is it a response to circumstances that we're in, but it actually, there were good reasons not to do it before?
I think before, because we imminently, like before, if you had ever said, you know, even 4 years ago, that a politician would deliberately lie, if we were in a discussion and anyone has suggested that, I think that there would have been a lot of nervous laughter and people would have thought you were kind of crazy. But now,
David, can I ask a question though? I don't mean to intervene. I'm sorry. I don't mean to kind of break your role. But Noam Chomsky wrote in 1969 about the fact explicitly Lyndon B. Johnson in the Vietnam War was lying, and that article got a lot of press and coverage. The discomfort doesn't come from the fact that that information wasn't available or that the knowledge wasn't out there. It was the fear that it was the truth. And I think that's the problem. It's about knowing a truth and being able to accept it and the consequences.
I totally agree, but I think that the difference back then was that truth seeking was, you know, even in the context of the Pentagon Papers or whatever, that truth seeking was seen to be more of the act of truth seeking was seen to be more of the domain of the investigative journalists. I think that kind of truth seeking that we're seeing right now has really become much more mainstream. It's yes, we knew that people, yes, we knew that politicians lied or stretched the truth or whatever, but to do so every day in and day out, on Twitter, on social media, to be so bold about it and to have no shame about it, I think that sort of in your face kind of thing is something that we've never dealt with before.
Right, but what you're pointing to is the disconnect that we're actually trying to address at Peeps, is that there's a disconnect between the people who are actually paid to study this in universities and actually are a public good, the research is a public good, and how much that's paid attention to, whether it's journalists, whether it's the public, et cetera. And that disconnect has only become broader since 1969, right? So I think what I'm trying to get at is, to me, the information space, if it's going to be healthy and productive, is going to be an ecosystem. It's going to be filled with diversity, and journalists can't be alone in producing that information, and they can't be alone in producing information that's considered reliable. And the information that can be made available to people through things like making academic information more accessible and bringing academics back into the real world with their writing, which is surprisingly challenging and a lot of fun, which is why we do it. 5 to 7 drafts every article. But creating healing across ruptures in communication and trust across the institutions. I just feel like that's something that would be really exciting to see made more active and fuller than we're seeing it being done right now.
I want to see if we can make all of this a little bit more concrete. And so I'm wondering if any of you have specific examples of stories, so particular stories produced by particular outlets that you thought were either done particularly well in terms of conveying trust and conveying their factual foundations and being helpful to readers or listeners or wherever their audience was, or ones that you thought really blew it and had an opportunity to tell an important story and didn't go about it in a way that was effective.
I think it's easier to talk in terms of the kinds of stories that we're doing now than specific examples. I'm thinking about, because now we're dealing with the pandemic and we're dealing with climate change. And I think that with the pandemic, it's easier for climate change deniers to say, well, that should take a backseat because that's not as important. And I think that this weekend, for example, you saw the Globe and Mail do a very extensive section on the green economy and what it means and following the money. And I think that that's the challenge, is that because we're dealing with this more immediate crisis, then we're just going to forget the other crisis that might even be bigger and more consequential. And so I think that, I mean, to me, that coverage this weekend that I'm still making my way through is a good example of the kinds of truth telling that we have to do very conscientiously right now. In order to stay relevant and in order to inform people. So that I think that's an example of a thematic thing that's going on right now, is that we can't lose sight. It's easy to lose sight of some of the other realities that are upon us right now.
Something I don't really cover myself, but I kind of have like such a fascination with is discrimination and bias in algorithms. And I think that we get very tied up in it with a kind of techno-utopian view of that, and also with the kind of surveillance that can happen with technologies that we're bringing into our home. And so where that those two things come together is like social cognition, like looking at people's faces and deciding whether they're trustworthy or not, which is something that's like huge in the tech sector. But I've seen some pretty breathless coverage of that, and like, isn't this cool science? And I follow some people who have really grounded expert critiques of that I find really interesting, because a lot of it is just bad science and phrenology, and actually enforces a lot of discrimination, which is kind of wild that we're creating new and wonderful technological ways of doing that. And so, I mean, that's a very specific example, but I think tech is a place where I'm always just like baffled about where we're getting the information and how we're conveying that. And it's such a complicated story, but it's so pervasive in our lives. It's just an example of something I think about a lot when I'm reading about different technologies, and have only really dabbled in a little bit when I was doing podcast production for The Atlantic, I think, is my best example of trying to do that kind of work and seeing how difficult it really is.
And what, to the extent that you have a sense, what do you attribute the breathlessness to? Like, where is that sort of softer coverage coming from?
In a big way, to me, or at least when I was doing that kind of coverage, it's very hard if you don't have a beat that you've covered for a long time and you don't have the support to do kind of big, long projects. Because, at the time I was a freelancer, I had been laid off from MTV. I've never really experienced a huge amount of job stability. It can be hard to know kind of spin from reality, and you can do a lot of research and can talk to a lot of experts, but especially it seems like to me in the field of technology, it's dealing with stuff that's very technical, and you at a certain point have to believe the leaders of the field, even if the leaders in a field, or maybe unfortunately if the leaders in the field are someone like Elon Musk. He's very well regarded, and some of the stuff he says, I have questions. And so,
as you should. Yeah.
Right. And it'd be hard because, he sells billion-dollar ideas that, time will tell, but I do have questions about them. So I think that is part of it. Like the journalism ecosystem doesn't really support beats and the kind of deep source building that you need to do that kind of work. I was looking at the FinCEN investigation from BuzzFeed and many other organizations that happened over the last 2 years. And I just thought, 2 years to work on one project, that's amazing. I love it. And the depth of the journalism you get from that is so self-evident.
Right.
So we're going
to... Sorry.
No, sorry. Go ahead.
No, actually, and that's when we actually created Peeps, that was a lot of the logic behind it, is what newsrooms actually have the money to send somebody to be a participant observer and do research in a community for 8 months to 2 years to 10 years. In some cases, some of our writers have been working with their communities for 40. So that kind of deep research it needs to be funded outside of a business model. It needs to be funded and recognized as a public good. The trick is getting it into the community. And in terms of investigative journalism, we're huge fans of Canada Land at Peeps. We were so excited to hear that you were going to be on touch. We think the work that you're doing is outstanding. And we just want to see it a little larger, a little broader, so that we can get all of this information that's out there that into their hands, so that they can put all of the work that you and that David are doing into context.
We're going to come back to the business model a little bit later in the conversation, because that's definitely underlying some of these. But I want to stick with the actual practice of journalism for a little longer. One thing that was really striking this summer was journalists, and especially journalists of color, talking more openly and I think more bluntly about the notion of objectivity and who gets to be considered a disinterested observer. We've seen this, for instance, in newsrooms refusing to send Black reporters to cover Black Lives Matter protests on the grounds that those Black reporters can't be neutral. But that idea that a journalist stands outside of events and reports on them neutrally is actually a relatively recent development. For most of the history of journalism, it wasn't a question of being disinterested. No one had a pretense to that. It was much more an ecosystem where everybody just knew what your point of view was or what your publication's point of view was, and that was better understood, perhaps. And the rhetoric that we have now about journalistic neutrality didn't really exist for a long time. And so I guess what I'm wondering is if the pendulum is swinging back to that idea of journalism, where the ideal isn't to be disinterested, but to be transparent about what your point of view is, and what the benefits and risks of that framing of journalism are.
So are we debating neutrality or objectivity?
Well, let's start with, are we starting to be more critical about the notion that objectivity is actually possible?
So from not journalism, sorry folks, but just cultural theory is deeply informed by a sense of accountability and ethics, and part of that increasingly is being explicit about your context and embedding that into the writing that you do, so that the filters through which you produce the information are evident and are part of the reader's experience to reject and or accept parts of what you've written based on the filters that you've written through. And by being that explicit, we found that people trust the information more and are more open to it than they would be otherwise, because everything is biased and everything is political. There's no way to avoid it. And so owning that space and owning your space, while acknowledging that you have a professional responsibility to see beyond it as best you can, is the best that we can ask for from our writers.
So I suppose the sort of the flip side of the framing would be, it's not actually a question that coming from a community makes you less objective. It actually gives you a certain kind of expertise. It gives you a certain kind of insight. But that still involves having a sense of the individual who's making the story, which is something that several generations of journalists have been raised and trained to be allergic to, right? It's not supposed to matter who wrote the story or who produced the segment, because you're just telling the truth and you're just conveying the facts.
But that also relies on a canonical context. I'm sorry, Hamutal.
Hamutal.
I'm like excited, so feel free to interrupt me.
No, excited is good. We like excited.
The fact is, what we've learned through, post-colonialism has really changed the academic institution that we work from and all of the spaces that journalists are trained in. And so as soon as you start bringing discrepant voices into production of information, and there's not one canonical voice, which is white all of a sudden you have to start announcing where you come from because there isn't a point of view that's accepted as the truth. And we're currently, I think, in the process of establishing a new truth, which is why it feels so chaotic and so uncomfortable and so frightening. And we're establishing priorities in how we communicate that and establish that. It's working in cultural theory. I'm not saying that it's perfect. I'm saying it's deeply debated even in cultural theory in the academy. But as they're working through it, this real sense of authenticity and accountability to your own point of view as it reflects what you produce, produces information that can be discussed, as opposed to an authoritative person coming in and saying, this is the way it is, this is the truth, this is the way, all of the facts presented without any personal context or human context to it. And I think, and additionally, it's big data. Stats and information aren't enough. There needs to be a narrative, and narrative comes from people.
And that's something that happens that I really like about my medium of podcasting and radio, that, people's voices are always highly personalized and individual, and people can speak. Even the host has to have a personality. It's a little bit different than writing. I think the way I think of objectivity, that in a useful way, as opposed to a way that just upholds the status quo and power, which frankly it always has, and I've only ever seen it used to bludgeon down dissenting voices, and I really dislike that. Is thinking of objectivity as a practice of check-ins with your own biases, of rigorous fact-checking, and entertaining notions that you haven't confirmed or refuted yet, and trying to reach something based on the facts rather than like what you think it should be. And it's also about doing that check-in during narrative building, but it is not a perfect process. It is not a thing, it's a process. And no one is objective or isn't objective. We can just interrogate the practices, which I think is building off your point.
I like, the fact that investigative journalists like to talk about, and I'm paraphrasing here, the subjectivity of purpose and the objectivity of method. I'm subjective because I think that climate change is a thing. I think it's a serious issue, and we have to cover it. The way I cover it, though, I have to have a method. I'm not necessarily going to give equal weight to climate deniers. I'm not going to say, okay, well, I'll pair a climate denier with a scientist, for example. Right. But I will, in following the green money and following what green tech is and how viable it is, and what role should banks play, and so on and so forth. You have to have a method to do that. You've got to know who the primary sources are, who the expert voices are, and that's what I talk about when I'm referring to objectivity of method, right? But the fact that I choose to investigate issues like climate change or institutional racism or whatever, means that I think that those are problems, and I think that we as journalists have to, in that sense, embrace our subjectivity. We have to dispense this notion that we are just these neutral conveyor of facts. It's just the facts, ma'am, and then you make up your mind. I think that we are not removed from the things that are happening. And I think that as long as we are transparent about our purpose and what we're doing, and open about our methodology, then I think that people have no problem with that. And I think that we have fewer problems with our credibility, which right now is taking a hit. And that could be one of the reasons why. So maybe that's the new business model, right? There's a reason that podcasts are doing well. There's a reason that niche publications are doing well.
Because you can do the dishes.
What's that?
Listening. It's because you can do the dishes while you're listening.
That too, yeah.
But I think you made a really good point about how we cover climate change and how that's actually changed in the last decade. And some institutions were slower than others to not try to give that kind of false equivalency between the
Yeah.
consensus on climate change and climate denial. I guess what I always wonder is like, what's the next thing we're going to realize we've done that with? And I think there's a lot of contenders, and how do we just apply that to stuff that might be hasn't really kind of entered the mainstream in the way that climate change has for journalism.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I think that, for example, how much voice do we give to the alt-right, for example? There's an abortion debate coming up in the United States with the confirmation hearings. What weight do we give? Like, how do we cover that? Or how do we cover the for lack of a better term, issues that fundamental Christians are really concerned about? Mm-hmm. They are a very powerful constituency. They were a force in the leadership race for the federal conservatives, for example. They may be a force to be contended with in the U.S. election. How do we give voice to that? In a way that respects what's going on out there and respects the views that but give voice to the views that they have. So I think that this is what I mean, right? It's and where are the false equivalencies? Where are they? I think that in those debates we just don't know yet. In climate change, we have an idea.
Yeah.
Right? In those other issues, haven't got a clue.
But it's communicating across what people understand to be truth. And next issue, it's coming out shortly. And one of our academics has actually looked at how evangelical Christian truth is created versus secular truth, and what the standards are, and what values inflect that production. And I think that's why I'm saying this isn't all on the journalists. This is about deeper social examination that needs to happen. And from that, we can start drawing some directions that could produce more productive conversations and more compassionate conversations. Because that polarization comes from people being embedded in their belief system and stuck in their bubbles and stuck in their echo chambers,
yeah.
And not having compassion across the culture. Because it is a different culture. It's the same country, it's a different culture. Mm. And that's what we feel like. And I keep saying it's Peeps, and I apologize. It's just, that's what we've been trying to fill the hole with the work that we're doing, is bringing these kind of conversations that help provide perspective on difference, even with communities that are our neighbors or are with us.
Mm-hmm.
That sounds so interesting. Sorry, that research.
I mean, maybe part of our role is to try to pierce those filter bubbles, right? And to generate that kind of conversation. But that's a hard job, right? It's a hard job, and it's hard to convince people to leave their comfort zones. Right?
But it's not just yours.
Be open-minded.
It's not just yours, though, right? Because this is a communication issue that's occurring, as I said earlier, across the institutions. There's a fundamental lack of communication that's happening between the two sides, because truth is constructed differently on each side. And so how do you get compassionate listening across a bridge right now that feels so guarded?
Mm-hmm.
I think one big, should I not interrupt? One more thing. I think a big component of this, I just think a big component of this is what Emily Bell and other experts refer to as the platform press. And, piercing filter bubbles and having this cross communication, it just seems impossible to me to reach new audiences without changing something fundamental about how people are getting their news through social media. Mm-hmm. There's so much research and so much great reporting that's coming out about Facebook algorithms, but platform press basically refers to the ways in which social media don't produce any content, but they are very much controlling the distribution of the content, who gets to see the content, like whether it's everybody or just certain silos of people, and how we as journalists or media institutions get paid for who gets to see it. And that is completely, Emily Bell argues that this has been a bigger shift than the shift from print to digital, and is, in a lot of ways, I think I agree, because that's not something that could be solved just by journalism or even just by the academy. That's basically an antitrust matter maybe at this point. And, Lena Kahn and Stacey Mitchell do great work on that. And I wonder how much we can try to get the engagement of different audiences while trying to constantly game an algorithm that we don't fully have access to understanding.
So there's a really, really interesting undercurrent in this conversation, which has to do with a tension between how journalists have historically understood what they were doing, which is to be almost transparent conveyors of information, and then you, the audience, decide what you will make of it. We say, Nixon said this, and then this thing happened. You go off and vote however you will. And there's been a lot of really, really interesting academic research in psychology, in behavioral economics, and a few sort of related disciplines in the last while that teaches us more about how people process information. And so, for instance, journalists have generally held that, my job is to tell you Nixon said X. Insert quote from Nixon here, then you go off. What psychologists tell us is the more that you repeat X, if X is a lie, even if you start by saying Nixon lied when he said X, in virtue of you republishing X or rebroadcasting X, I, as an audience member, am going to become more likely to believe it. Even though you're telling me it's a lie, in virtue of the repetition, I'm going to be more likely to think that it's true. And so, I think it's something that social media plays off of very, very effectively. Social media has learned how to weaponize a lot of these insights. And I guess what I'm wondering is whether your journalistic practice or your understanding of what journalistic best practices could or should be, at least right now, have changed given these things that we keep learning about how humans actually process information. So we can't just be transparent conveyors because we can't pretend to be that dumb about what happens when someone receives it anymore.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that, in a sense, we're almost circling back to where we started the discussion, which was, the people like Donald Trump, they know that they can take advantage of the conventions of journalism, which is if you say something, it will get repeated. And that's your end game, right? As long as it gets repeated, it's out there, people believe it. Hey, I'm good, right? And so I think that what's happening more and more is that you've got, Twitter, for example, speaking of social media, saying we are not going to be purveyors of truths that we know to be false, so-called truths that we know to be false. If you are knowingly telling a lie, we are not just going to let you broadcast that. And I think that might be a new norm where you just say no. If that's if that's a falsehood, then we're just not going to broadcast it. Just as when we're talking about racism and there are racist diatribes, we are not going to repeat those diatribes. We are not going to give voice. We are not going to give credence to those diatribes. And so the same, I guess we can start to then put facts in the same category that no, we're not going to repeat that if we know that it is false and it is divisive and it is said for a particular purpose. So maybe that's how journalism is sort of changing. And maybe when, after November, that will be one of the Trump legacies that will see itself sprout not only in the United States, but throughout the Western world, where you have an active, responsible media. And maybe you'll have media outlets that will be more aggressive in that regard. I'll be very interested to see if that happens.
So I guess that, David, what you've just described is something that I think people inside media, people who work in the industry, will sort of understand what is happening with that more quickly. It won't necessarily be clear if you're a layperson. But I am wondering what what we all can do, what media outlets can do to sort of more directly build or rebuild trust in our audiences?
I think that there are a couple, I mean, there's infinite number of suggestions, but two things I've been kind of hung up on lately to create a more optimistic journalistic ecosystem maybe is that first, I think that accessibility to journalism being an affordable, accessible profession needs to happen or happen again. It was never an open and fair playing field. And now that it's so hard to make a living as a journalist, it seems to, in some ways, it seems to be even more narrow. Like, you know, and I'm a beneficiary of this. Like my first internship, actually my second internship was I got paid $12 a day to work at WNYC. I learned everything I know about radio from there, but obviously that means I wasn't the best candidate. I was the best candidate who could afford to take the internship. And, you know, journalism suffers for that. And so I think one way of trying to make a more equitable workforce and diversifying it is organizing, unionizing, like we did at Canadaland, like I tried to do at MTV before they fired us. I think that's an important way is to have like an labor organizing in journalism. Another thing that I think might be very key to it is like the kind of transparency that I really try to build into my work. And an example of that is like Cool Mules was a true crime podcast, but it was also kind of media criticism just by virtue of me coming from a media criticism background, what we do at Canadaland and previous work I'd done on the media. And I think I put a lot of faith in my listeners to hear things that with context you would know are not true, but are revealing of a person anyways. And it's a very fine line between just like parroting what someone said. He said this, that's reporting. People do that, you know, he said this, then she said this, and, you know, how am I to say? But I did try to at least, he said this, and in the context of this document from the Australian courts, this document from the Canadian courts, it doesn't seem to match up. That's an example of what we did, while trying to tell a more fulsome and complicated story than just like, here are the reportable facts I have. So I think some transparency that we're moving towards, that we've all gestured and talked about in this panel, is really vital. And the accompanying media literacy comes from maybe practicing with that stuff, and maybe comes from stronger institutions, like you were saying, Anya-Milana, that we don't exist in a vacuum. And there's a lot of trust issues with many public institutions that have seen an erosion of funds and of credibility over the last couple of decades. And I think that is coming home to roost in journalism in a way that I find troubling.
What do you, each of you, find that the public understands the least about your work or about the practice of journalism? What are we not doing a good job of explaining about how this all actually works?
I think how we choose stories. You know, why do you report on the things that you know, I mean, that was, you know, that I don't know how many times I've heard that question, that criticism. Why do you guys always report on this or that? Or why are you guys always so negative? Or, you know, why can't you tell us some good news every once in a while? You know, like that kind of thing, right? So I think, it's like why we make the choices. And I think that, I like what, you know, you're saying is that we need to be more transparent. We need to explain to people why we're doing things. This is why we're being negative, but then when we finish this, we're actually going to do stories about how you can, you know, how people have solved this problem, right? And we call that solutions journalism, right? And then, you know, in another series or whatever, we might explain to you what the different sides are saying. So if you explain your coverage and your methodology and why you're doing things the way you are, then I think that does build trust. And that's something that, if you take a look at, you know, the evolution of data journalism, it used to be called computer assisted reporting. it was a bit of a radical thought that you would actually share your methodology. You would share your code with people.
Really?
And they could take your code and they could reproduce what you do. And if they reproduce it, then it's fine. And if they don't, then maybe there were problems with your methodology and your conclusions, right? And that was, I remember, when we were talking about this 10, 15, 20 years ago, that was a radical thought. Well, what do you mean you're going to open yourselves up to the public and explain to them what you do? Because we were very closed, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that you're seeing that more and more and more, is that we are very open about why we do things, what our end goal is. And I think that that's a good thing.
Yeah. And audiences seem to be demanding it.
Yeah. Yes, as they should.
Mm-hmm.
The one that I actually find, and I don't know that other people would recognize it as such, but the one that I think is most potentially damaging is that I find that by and large, people who aren't in the industry don't understand that the industry is an economic crisis.
Yes.
And the pressures that creates on newsrooms to turn out things quickly, why we don't have as many beat reporters anymore, why we don't have beat editors anymore, right? It used to be old school at a newspaper. There was an editor who handled all the health stories because they actually spent a long, long time in that field and built up some expertise. That doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah.
The ways in which that really slows down efforts at equity and at representation. I don't know many people outside of journalism who understand that. And mostly what I get is, but everyone reads the news all the time now because Donald Trump, so you must be doing great. And not understanding the kind of pressure that we all know ourselves to be under and the stories that we can't assign or that we can't pursue or can't pursue in depth is one that I really, really struggle with, because then it just comes across as begging for more money.
Yeah. I mean, I was
so
good.
Sorry. Deloitte and Touche came out with a report at the beginning of the year indicating that while the Scandinavian countries have households that pay for memberships for between 3 and 4 news sources every month.
Wow.
Willingly, Canadians and Americans and Europeans as well have become, who aren't Scandinavian, have become very accustomed to getting free information. And our response to that at Peeps is you get what you pay for. If you're paying for the information, you're getting information that's ethically produced and produced to standards because you're our employer. If somebody else is paying for it, it's being paid for a reason. And this idea that information can be produced in a business model that has been adopted by the media industry until it started being challenged very recently by independent media, which makes me very happy. It was impossible to have a newsroom that could produce at an increasingly profitable level the kind of information that people actually need. And I think recognizing that information is a public good and that the public has a choice to either pay for it themselves or have some kind of resource that ensures that it gets paid is an important part of the conversation in creating the kind of, because the media is the way those institutions communicate in no small part.
Mm-hmm.
So we have about 90 seconds left. And I'm so rapid fire lightning round, 20 seconds each. What gives you hope?
People want truth. People want information. And the issues coming up are such that climate change, for example, are such that people are going to need the information. And I think that we're in a position to do it. We just got to figure out the business model that works.
Kasha?
Every time I hear from an engaged person who listened to something that we did, I feel a lot better. And I feel like, podcasts are still on the rise, and we'll find the new way of getting information to people that they're really excited about.
Anya-Milana, 20 seconds. What gives you hope?
I think people are very aware of the fact that the information system is broken and that they are looking for other resources. They're just get it in a way that doesn't require more from them. More thinking, more money, more anything. But when it becomes important enough, they'll find us.
Okay, thank you all very much. We actually ran 5 minutes over, but we're given permission because of how the conversation was going. So thank you all for that.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for this. We've all been in the back and screaming about how useful and insightful and important this is right now, especially now with things coming up on this planet. So thank you all so much for sharing sort of the secret life of journalism and making it not so secret anymore. We really appreciate it.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.
Take care.
Thank you for inviting us. Cheers.
Thank you.
Bye.
So coming up at 4:30, after just a short break, we'll be welcoming Stephanie McGrath and Joni Placido of Kobo Writing Life to talk about building a writing community through podcasting. We will see you then.
Hello, and welcome back. We are now going to be doing the How to Build a Writing Community Through Podcasting panel. For this panel, we have the hosts of the Kobo Writing Life podcast, Stephanie McGrath and Joni D. Placido. They will share how Kobo has created a unique writing community for indie authors. They will delve into how they create their episodes, share their interview techniques, and how they grew their podcast audience. They will also share how podcast marketing is rapidly evolving and how they have used their podcast to market not only Kobo Writing Life, but Kobo as a company. Now, please welcome our two panelists. Hello.
Hi.
Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for coming here. We're really excited about this panel. I'll just do a brief introduction of both of you, and then you can take it away. So Stephanie McGrath works on our content management team at Kobo Writing Life. She studied book and media studies and English literature at the University of Toronto. She loves to discuss popular culture, true crime, and the latest romance book she's reading. And Joni is Kobo's author engagement specialist and has worked with Kobo since 2017. She studied Italian and Spanish language and literature at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. She loves to read literary and contemporary fiction and is always happy to share podcast recommendations. Take it away.
Thanks so much. So as Vanessa said, we're here today from Kobo Writing Life, which is Kobo's indie publishing platform. We're the producers and co-host, and our podcast covers everything to do with the craft of writing and the business of publishing. So we're going to speak to you a little bit today about our experiences, what we've learned from our podcast, and the way that podcasts are being used more and more in book selling and within the author community.
So just to introduce ourselves, I'm Stephanie. I am the content management specialist for Kobo Writing Life. I don't know why I went ahead, which is self-publishing. So basically my job is try to make it as easy as possible for authors to publish ebooks and audiobooks on our store, and also make it easier for them to enroll in programs such as Overdrive and Kobo Plus. So if anything goes wrong on the dashboard, such as trying to opt in your book or trying to upload your book and you're encountering problems, it's my job to fix it. And as you probably know, I am also the host, one of the hosts of the Kobo Writing Life podcast.
And I am the author engagement specialist, as Vanessa said, and my job is essentially to help authors with the business aspect of indie publishing, selling more books. So I also work with them on promotions, merchandising, library promotions, and subscriptions.
The Kobo Writing Life podcast first launched in 2013. It was released in conjunction with the Kobo Writing Life platform, which was allowing authors for the first time able to publish their books on Kobo. And then it was created by Mark Lefebvre, who used to be the old director of Kobo Writing Life. And also, he is also an indie author. So the podcast was one of the first podcasts on the market that were actually telling authors how to publish their books independently and teaching authors how to succeed in this landscape. And it kind of launched, 2013 was the year when self-publishing really exploded, and it became popular for authors to break away from traditionally publishing and going indie.
So how do we do it? Our episodes are typically interview format. So our first challenge is choosing guests. So we're kind of lucky in that this podcast has been around a little bit longer than we have at Kobo, and we have a pretty robust community and a lot of people who are interested in being guests on the podcast. We have a bit of an advantage in that many of our guests come from the Kobo Writing Life community. So lots of authors. We've had some of the authors featured, well, all of the authors featured here have been on the podcast. And we've also had a lot of interviews with people within Kobo, industry experts. We've had marketing specialists from Kobo Talk, our originals director, our subscriptions director. So we've had a lot of insider knowledge and expertise. And we've also had other publishing professionals from outside of Kobo. So Day on Audio is an example. We've had Toronto Public Library on a couple of times, Grant Faulkner from NaNoWriMo, the team at Overdrive, and BookBub, among many others. And finally, we also do quite a few interviews with traditionally published authors. And we tend to focus mostly on craft. We talk a little bit about their books, and something that I think that they always appreciate is, I think when authors are touring a new book, they do a lot of interviews and they talk about the book and we like to talk to them more about the writing process, how they got started, what it's like for them, and basically all of the kind of insider being a writer stuff. And I think a lot of them really like talking about that. So that's something that's a little bit different with our podcast.
We should mention that episodes are between 30 and 60 minutes in length. And each episode we try to give listeners a tip or trick that they can use to succeed in either self-publishing themselves or traditionally publishing, or also improving their craft. One
of the great things about finding guests as well is that we find that nobody really says no when we ask them for an hour of their time. Like we've had people that are way bigger than our podcast featured, like Karen Slaughter is a big one, and she was a fantastic guest. And really all we've had to do is ask, because a lot of people are quite willing to chat for an over Zoom because it doesn't take that much time and it's talking. So that's been a really cool part of doing the podcast.
And I would just say, if you're interested in interviewing someone that is like you think really famous, or like they would have no interest in you, if you just lay it out, like, I think you're really insightful in these certain topics, I've heard you on this podcast, or I saw you tweet this, and make sure that they know that you're interested in them and what they can bring to your podcast or interview, that really gives them the extra push to come onto your show and talk to you or whatever you want to be doing.
So in terms of our interview technique, we try to keep things really casual, really conversational, and a big part of getting a really great interview is making the guests feel relaxed. So we spend a little bit of time chatting with them before we hit the record button. We let them know what kind of topics we want to cover, how the interview is going to work, what they need to do if they say something. Sometimes they say something that maybe they shouldn't be talking about publicly, and then we can cut that out, or they say something and garble it and they want to retape it, and that's fine. So we let them know, like, everything's fine. If time goes in the middle of the podcast, that's not a problem. So we take the time to make them feel at ease, and I think that helps a lot. We also make sure that we tell them when we're going to hit record, which is really important.
Yeah, they need to know, because it could be a problem, but yes.
So Steph and I normally create topics in advance. We do a little bit of research into who we're interviewing, but we try not to pre-interview. So what that means is we don't send the questions ahead of time unless the author really wants them, because we want it to be relatively natural. So we give them an idea, like, we want to talk about this. We don't want to blindside you, but we also want to hear something that's not overly rehearsed. And the other thing is that we don't want to have a conversation before we hit record that we really wish was on the podcast, because it's not as natural and it can come out as a little bit stilted, and it's never as good the second time. So we try to have it be fresh, and that's an important part of that. We used to send the questions in advance, and I think that it's better now. The other thing that I like about that is that sometimes an author will say something really interesting that we didn't know about, and then we'll be able to meander down a different topic and deep dive into something that maybe we hadn't expected to. And we've had some really insightful conversations based on that. So part of that is actively listening to what they're saying and reacting to it, not just going to, well, that was interesting, we're going to move on to our topic because that's what we have. No, we react to what they're saying. And asking the same question twice, this isn't about pushing them to answer things that they don't want to, but more that sometimes things do take a tangent and you maybe don't get to hear about what you wanted to hear about. And if the author's comfortable with it, it's okay to go back and say, hey, I know that we got sidetracked, but I really would like to know more about how you do this, that, and the next thing. So that's important, and we try to finish on a high note. Our questions are kind of similar but different with everyone, but we try to finish every podcast with asking authors what they've been enjoying lately. So it can be books, podcasts, movies, television shows, whatever it is, and they're always enthusiastic to tell us. They always have great recommendations. A lot of the time they're book recommendations, and we're all book nerds at Kobo. All of our listeners are book nerds, so it's great to get those recommendations in.
I think people also kind of think that's a frivolous question, but I think authors are kind of the best people to ask about great stories, and every recommendation they've given us has been great and like something I am going to check out no matter what.
So tools of the trade, it's important to note that you don't really need anything to start a podcast. That's one of the cool things about it. You just need some kind of device that records and some sort of basic editing software. Podcasts really run the gamut from being really, really basic recorded conversations to being high production value, immersive audio experiences. So this podcast went on for a long time with nothing other than microphones, an empty meeting room, and whatever computer software, GarageBand, came with the computer. When last year, I believe, Kobo started their own podcast. So Kobo Writing Life has had a podcast for several years, and Kobo now has Kobo in Conversation. And they created a makeshift podcast studio. So they have, we now in the office have a somewhat soundproof studio with 2 basic microphones, and that's been really, really great. So we were using that for a long time. And then the office shut down in March, and we were told, go home for 2 weeks. And in 2 weeks, when the pandemic's over, we'll all come back. And so we pushed all of our interviews, went home, and realized that we were going to be here for a long time. So we figured we better figure out how to make this work at home. So we invested in Yeti microphones, which are pretty affordable. They're under $200, I believe. And they connect with a USB. They're super easy to use, and they're great for recording podcasts. So that's one thing. We've also started to use Calendly, which is a scheduling software tool, which we didn't know about for a long time. This is fairly recent. And we're often speaking with guests from all over the world. Steph and I both have full-time jobs that are not the podcast. And so we were trying to work things out with different time schedules and our 2 calendars. And we would have these long email chains back and forth about it. Calendly syncs up both of our calendars and then shows authors and guests when we're available between a specific time. So we have it set 9 to 5. You can book yourself in for any time slot, but it's blocked off wherever we have meetings or any other kind of commitments. It adjusts to the author's time zone. So if we're emailing someone in the UK, they can see when it's going to work for them. Steph and I get an email saying so-and-so guest has booked in a time slot here, and then it's in our calendar. So that has been a bit of a godsend.
We also have questions like, can you give us your bio, which really helps when we're writing up the blog post that we have this one document we can reference with all the information.
Yeah. I feel like I don't really need to talk about the value of Zoom because we all now know how Zoom works. But we found we were using Zoom to record even back in the office because we were always speaking to people remotely. So we found that super valuable. And Libsyn is our
uploading
platform. Yeah. So we upload episodes to Libsyn, and then they're distributed to just about anywhere that you can access a podcast. It's a pretty simple upload process, upload audio files, the logo images, all the information about the episode and metadata, and they send that out. That's the one that we've been using since we started. I know it's a service that you pay for, and there's different tiers depending on how much you need and how many episodes that you're releasing.
And it also shows you where your downloads are coming from, and gives you like detailed statistics on how many downloads were this month compared to last year, stuff like that.
In terms of production, again, we keep it pretty simple. We have an hour-long, say, half an hour to a full hour-long interview, which we record whenever our guest is available. And then when it comes to actually publishing an episode, we have about a 1-week turnaround time. So we record a fresh intro and outro for every episode because we like it to sound fresh and natural. And we also like to be able to talk a little bit about who our guest was and the context of when we were interviewing. A lot of the time, we did a lot of interviews at the beginning of lockdown, and we made a lot of comments about this time and what's going on. And then when we go do those intros, we can kind of contextualize a little bit and say what was happening in the world when we did this interview. So we tend to do those on Thursday. And we'll talk more about this later, but we used to do all of our editing in-house, and Steph can talk to you about how much pain was involved in that.
Very long.
Yeah. So we have our intro and outro sections. We have our main section, and we do our credits at the end. So we send all of those different pieces of recording. We've also got a custom podcast theme tune. And that gets sent to the editor on Friday. She edits over the weekend. She sends us back the completed audio file with all of those parts stitched together by Monday night. It gets uploaded and published to Libsyn on Tuesday, and then it goes out into all the various feeds. And then we put a write-up about the episode on our Kobo Writing Life blog by Wednesday. And then the whole process starts again, where we record on Thursday for the intro and outro. We feel most comfortable with a few episodes in the bank. Right now, we're recorded all the way up till December. So we've got weekly episodes ready to go. And we're taking a little bit of a hiatus from recording as much as we were. And I like that because it means if there's an issue, if one of us is sick or something, we don't need to panic about getting an episode recorded today.
And it also helps if, let's say, an author has a release or their book was moved. So, because we like to schedule an episode when a new book is being released. We have the ability and flexibility to move around the schedule and what episodes are going to be released when. So we're going to talk a little bit about how we grew our audience. So in 2018 is when I took over the podcast. And at that time, the downloads were pretty steady. We weren't noticing a big increase in downloads, but it had been around since 2013, like we mentioned. But 2019, my old co-host, Chrissy, she actually got a new job. So I was needing help, which is when Joni joined me as co-host, which I'm extremely thankful for and couldn't do it without her. But we decided to take off a month of releasing episodes to revamp the podcast and adjust some of the things that we didn't think were working quite as well. And these are some of the techniques we did to grow our audience when we took our break.
So we used to have a bi-weekly release schedule, and we had a talk with somebody who has a podcast book, Amanda Capito. She's been on our podcast, and she suggested trying to increase the cadence to weekly. And we were like, this is already a lot of work, but yeah. But we were able to make it work, and we updated the release schedule to weekly. And that did a lot to our podcast numbers. They increased enormously, and we were like, well, clearly this works. So yes, let's double the number of episodes we produce. So that was one of the biggest factors. Another one was adding new platforms. I was surprised at how many people listen to podcasts on YouTube. But that has been the case for us. We started a YouTube channel. We now put the recording up there. There's no video. It's just audio only. And we found that it's had a ton of traction.
My guess is that YouTube is so popular is because people usually listen to episodes when they're working, and that's how they're able to listen. Rather than through their app, they listen on their computer when they're working.
We've also experimented a little bit with cross-promotion and sponsorships on other podcasts. So we've got Joanna Penn. We have a regular ad on her podcast. She is a super influential indie author in the UK. She runs a How to Be a Writer course, and so she has a lot of indie authors following her, going to her when they're looking into publishing independently, and so we get a lot of traction from her ads. We've also started with the Rebel Author podcast. Sasha Black runs a podcast where she's talking to other authors about writing, publishing, all of that kind of thing. And we also run ads on her podcast. And we've done a bit of cross-promotion with Adam Croft, who has a series of books called The Indie Author Mindset, as well as a very successful crime series. He has a lot of thrillers. So he really knows his way around the indie publishing landscape. He loves Kobo. He talks about us all the time. So he's guested on our podcast a few times, and we've done a little bit of cross-promotion there. We've also experimented with non-author podcasts. We ran an ad over the summer with the Guilty Feminist podcast, which is nothing to do with writing at all, but it's a very, very large, highly engaged audience because we're trying to think of ways we can reach people who are not already in the indie author community and people who might be thinking about writing and looking at different ways to doing it. And a really, really big part of us being able to grow the podcast was getting help with it. When our former co-host, or Steph's former co-host, left, we talked about what we were going to do with the podcast. Were we going to be able to keep doing it? And it was sort of either we're going to stop doing it and just let it die, or we're going to double it and we're going to go every week and we're going to make it bigger and better. And in order to do that, something had to give. We didn't have. Steph was editing them in the office and outside of work time, and doubling the amount of episodes produced was never going to work. So we outsourced them. We have a freelance editor now, and she does all of that for us, which is enormous because, I don't know, Steph, what does it take? 3 hours, 4 hours?
It used to take me, the person who has no experience, 3 to 4 hours on top of like my actual job. So it was impossible, basically.
Yeah. And I mean, I've edited a couple of episodes, and I find it really, really challenging because it does take a long time, but you can do it. Even if you don't have any experience, it is doable. There's Audacity for PCs, is a free editing software. And like I said, we've used GarageBand. So it is something that you can do yourself. It's just something that is tough to do yourself if you don't have any experience. We also enlisted a coworker's help with writing up the blog post. So she has the super fun job of listening to us talk every week, and then she writes up notes, posts them on the blog, and she also does all the uploading to Libsyn. So that has been super helpful and has been a huge factor in allowing us to increase over the last year.
Thank you, Rachel, for doing that for us.
Yeah, shout out to Rachel. We also updated the format a little bit. After Chrissy left, we took our little hiatus and we talked about things that we could do to make it sound a little bit new and fresh. Like, we have a new host, we have something new going on. Let's keep things updated. So one of the things that we did was that we used to re-record the intros and outros, and it was one recording, and we just stuck it on the end and beginning of every episode. And now we record it fresh every time, which is a little bit of a pain because we do need to meet and do that every single week. But I think it does sound better, and it does give the podcast a little bit more life. It also allows us to talk about any kind of promos or anything interesting that's happening at KWL. We can drop that into the outro and make sure that we include different calls to action at the end of the podcast. And then, yeah.
Oh, we also started including like audiobook excerpts into the podcast. So when we're talking to a guest and they mentioned a book, we would be able to show or let listeners hear what that story was actually about.
Yeah, and that's something important to mention. Like, we can do that because the authors are uploading their content independently to us. So they own it. We're allowed to post anything that they want because they own the content. If we're working with a traditional publisher, we do need to get permission to play audio excerpts. And the same goes for if you're considering starting a podcast and you want to include music or audio excerpts or anything, just make sure that you check the rules around what you're allowed to share. Yeah. And then the fifth thing was that Steph talked about getting feedback from listeners, which I was a little bit hesitant about, but I'll let Steph take over.
So we did decide to send out a survey, like Joni mentioned. I mean, when you're sending out a survey, you never know the feedback you're going to get. It could be anything, but like the main goal of the survey was to see why were people listening to us? What were they enjoying about our episodes? Why were they coming back? Where did they find out about us? So we asked them a few questions along with like a text field, which we'll get into in a little bit. So I was like wondering who they were, how old were they, how long had they been listening to the podcast? We found out that a lot of listeners had been coming to us from the Joanna Penn podcast, and quite recently too. So we could see that the promo that we were doing with her was working quite well, actually. And then we wanted to learn more, like, are you self-published? Are you traditionally published? Are you both? Are you an aspiring writer? And then, which we did find out, majority of them are self-published, but we did have a few hybrid authors in there. And how often were they listening? It was interesting to see that they actually listened to it to the week it releases, because, I mean, I know personally, I have a lot of podcasts on my subscribe list, so it takes me a while to get through all of them. But it was interesting to see how engaged they were. And the people that were filling out this podcast were they were already engaged listeners. I don't think you would get many people who didn't really care about the podcast to come and fill out your survey. So what the feedback that they had was really helpful to us. So these are some of the feedback that we got. So it was we asked them what they wanted to see, what episodes they liked the best. So as you can see, they really love romance writers. And then they really love Kobo-specific episodes. So as Joni mentioned, we interview people in the office, but getting a behind-the-scenes look really interests our audience, because it's kind of behind the curtains to see what a tech company actually does. And there's like everyone that we interview at Kobo is like a subject matter expert in their own specific job, and just hearing them talk about stuff is really valuable to both us and our listeners. And then we got some what would you say formatting? Personal feedback. Someone said
it wasn't bad. I was scared about the personal feedback, but this was all we got.
Yeah. So I learned that we talk too fast, but I think we already knew that. And that I have a Canadian accent that can be hard to decipher. Not sure how true that is. Depends on where you're listening from. A lot of our listeners are actually from the US, so it makes sense. But the slow down feedback was actually really helpful. And when we bought our new mics, we got mics that we were able to listen to what we're saying as we're saying it, which has really helped to slow us down and also makes us conscious of like, oh, we need to really slow down. Can't really help that when we're in the interview and we get too excited, but it was good to know that that should be something we're paying attention to. So the feedback was really allowed us to see what episodes people love, which they want to see more of, and their ideas of where we're kind of missing out, and really gear our latest episodes to what they want to see. And as you can see here, these are our downloads increasing from 2018 to 2020. And that dip you'll see in July is when we took our hiatus. And then once we got back, and to be honest, there wasn't really a big difference. Like you would maybe assume that downloads would go down after you had a long hiatus, but it was fine. And because once they're subscribed, they're going to get the notification when they're back up anyways. Yep.
So we know that the podcast landscape is rapidly evolving and expanding. There's all kinds of really exciting things going on. We've got original content coming with Michelle Obama's collaboration with Spotify. We've got people doing really creative things with immersive audio experiences, documentary style. We've still got the old conversational two people chatting, which is how it originally started out. But there's a lot going on with podcasting. And one of the cool things about it is that it was pretty pandemic proof in terms of creating podcasts. People had a lot of time to sit at home. And as Steph and I have found out, it's pretty easy to do everything that you need to do from home. So there's been a lot of new podcasts coming out during this lockdown period. And I think there was a concern that because people often listen to podcasts while they're commuting or traveling, that there would be a drop in listenership. But studies have shown that no, people are still fully engaged and listening to podcasts. And I guess people are still taking long walks. We know also that 74% of podcast users listen to podcasts to learn something new. And that's something that we try to be mindful of to make sure that we do include something insightful and educational in every episode. And that ends up being pretty easy because we're talking to some really smart people who have interesting insights about what they do or knowledge to share. So that's been great. We also know that in Canada, 60 million homes have podcast listeners.
We should also mention
many people.
In our survey results, someone was like, I'm really conscious of how I spend my time. So I want something that I'm listening to be educational. So like we said, everyone wants to learn a little bit of something from a podcast. So we'll talk a little bit about marketing and Kobo. So the podcast kind of provides a unique opportunity for us to market Kobo Writing Life, but also Kobo as a whole. And currently we don't charge anyone to be on our podcast. Interviews are free. We don't have any ads. It's an ad-free podcast. And it's kind of when we're interviewing an author, it's kind of an organic way to promote them. And what I mean by that is because when you have an author on the podcast and they're talking about their latest book, someone who's interested in that book is going to be like, okay, I know it's on Kobo and I'm going to go buy it because I'm interested in that. And as you can see, a lot of our listeners, half of them are already Kobo customers, and they're more likely to buy something they've heard about on the podcast as well. We also started including promo codes. We talked about this briefly for a second. So like Joni mentioned, since authors own the rights to their own work, they are able to discount it at any price that they want. So we started to include free, if you use this code on Kobo, you can get this book for free based on the author that we were currently interviewing. So we've done that for ebooks and audiobooks, and it's really a great way for new readers to find new authors that they're going to love and try out new books in ways maybe not they wouldn't have otherwise, since podcast marketing is kind of new. It's like we mentioned, it's kind of like we're just trying it out. We're trying to see what works and what doesn't, but it's a great way to see what could happen. And So just to talk a little bit about what other writers are doing. So a lot of writers are doing really interesting things about podcasting to promote their own work. So Joanna Penn created her own podcast about writing and publishing and book marketing, which is like one of the top writing podcasts out there that everyone listens to, both traditionally and self-published. The Rebel Author podcast by Sasha Black, she started it recently too. And it was about kind of craft, but also the business of writing. It depends on the episode that you're listening to, but she started that up recently too, which is really interesting to hear. And then you have the kind of original content podcast created by authors. So the Read Me Romance podcast is created by authors Tessa Bailey and Alexa Riley, and every episode is a novella written by an author that you may like. So they have every episode is different. It's a new novella that hasn't been written before, and it's just been created for this podcast. And then they release that I'm not sure, maybe once a month, every 2 weeks. Not sure what their download or release frequency is, but it's been really interesting to see how authors, specifically romance authors, are very open to new ideas and trying things out, which has been interesting to see. And then Partners in Crime is a podcast by Adam Croft and Robert Dawes. So he's a big crime fiction writer, like over 1 million books sold, and he created a podcast for crime fiction fans. So if you're interested in his book, you're probably very likely also going to be interested in this podcast where they talk about crime. And they have celebrity guests from TV, film, and books. So anything about podcasts is like limitless. You can do anything. And I think it's like podcasting is a great platform to be creative and try something new because there's no rules. Kind of like self-publishing. There's no rules on how you could get a podcast.
Yeah, it's true. I think that's something that's opens it up to being able to do just about anything. You can get super niche. You can do something really weird, but anything that you think is interesting and you think a couple of other people will think is interesting, you can make a podcast about, and the sky's the limit. You can talk about whatever you want. Nobody's going to tell you not to produce it. So yeah, in that way, it is a bit like indie publishing. You can get really exciting content out there. So some of the key takeaways that we've learned in our tenure as podcast hosts, strategic release and promotion of episodes. So switching from bi-weekly to weekly was enormous for us. And so is promoting episodes. We promote everything on social media every week. So we use Twitter, Facebook, sometimes Instagram, and then our blog to promote new episodes and authors. And the other great thing is a lot of the time our guests have their own platforms, so they're also promoting their episodes. Opening should be natural and quick, no rambling. I don't know that Steph and I get this right all the time, but we do try. Closing should have a clear call to action. So for us, we urge people to go and sign up for Kobo Writing Life, to look into indie publishing, and often we're driving them to go and check out the work that our guest has. So either their book or whatever it is that they do. If they're a librarian, we tell them to check that out. Something else to note, and this is where Steph and I really were at an advantage because the podcast has been around longer than we've been at Kobo. And so we already had a built-in audience. We weren't growing from zero. And the audience that we have because the podcast has been around for a while and people subscribe and they keep listening. But if you're starting a new podcast, I think it's important to keep in mind that it won't happen right away and that consistency is the most important thing. Keep releasing episodes, keep putting them out there. More people will listen and your audience will increase over time. Don't be afraid to pivot. Again, as Steph said, there's a lot of room for experiment. You can see what's working, you can gather feedback, and you can make adjustments as you want based on that feedback. And it's your content to experiment with, so you've got that freedom. And yeah, lots of parallels between self-publishing and podcasting in that way. You can experiment with ads and you can change your logo and images and all kinds of things. See what works.
I'm like looking forward to when writers start putting out original stories in podcast form, which they've done already, but I think maybe someone like taking up an idea and just putting it on a podcast rather than writing a book. I'm excited to see where stuff is going in that way.
We have a question from YouTube. What is your favorite episode of the KWL podcast that you would recommend to new listeners? Steph, do you have one?
Let's see. Do you? I'm like, I have a blank. I don't remember any of them.
It depends on what you're there for. If you're there to listen to a specific author, we have a lot of really, really great ones on craft. If you're there to find out more about indie publishing and about Kobo, I think maybe the Michael Tamlin one's a good starting point. He's Kobo's CEO. He gives a really great overview of what we do at Kobo and talks about indie publishing, but it really depends on what you're looking for.
I would say also, so Dale Mayer is a big indie author, but the title of the podcast is How I Write 9,000 Words Before Breakfast. So like she publishes, how many books would you say in a year, Joni? Like at least over 10.
12 to 15, yeah.
Yeah. And like hearing her process, like she doesn't write on a keyboard, she dictates her books, and like listening to that has been so interesting to see how different people's writing process. So I would definitely recommend Dale Mayer. There's a lot of good ones. Oh, if you like audiobooks, we recently talked to Dion Audio about like what does audiobook production look like under a publishing house.
Yeah, that was really interesting. We did one in-house with Michelle Katz as well, where she talked about her experience at audiobooks.com and kind of being there at the beginning of the audiobook boom. So that one's cool. And I found, I like all of the craft ones. I think that talking to authors and business ones, the author ones are all really interesting. Yeah. And then in the manner of our podcast, we thought we'd finish with what have we been loving lately and give you a rundown of some of our podcast recommendations, because none of ours crossed over. So we thought that we'd share them.
Yeah, that's true.
Okay, so I want to go real quick with this. The high-low, I like two journalists who are talking, UK journalists. They're talking about what's in the news, pop culture, and lots of book recommendations. So they do a lot of author interviews, all literary fiction usually, or nonfiction. I like that one. Fake Heiress is BBC miniseries dramatization of the Anna Delvey scam. That one is fun. Grounded.
It is. I can confirm.
It's fun. Grounded came out of lockdown. So Louis Theroux is a BBC journalist who is home lockdown, and he just chats with famous people he's always wanted to chat to during lockdown because everyone had all kinds of time. That one's great. Desert Island Discs has been running for 50 years. It's a radio show where they ask people to give their 10 discs that they would bring to a desert island if they were cast away. And they've talked to just about everyone you've ever heard of in your life who's been on Desert Island Discs. And it's just a really fun podcast format. Guilty Feminist is comedy, UK comedy. It's filmed in front of a live audience. So it's a comedy show that talks about a lot of contemporary issues and is a lot of fun to listen to. Steph, go.
So my recommendations are, they're a little all over the place, but the first one I want to recommend is Fated Mates. It is created by a romance author, Sarah MacLean, and a romance critic, Jennifer Prokop. And the first season was them talking about the Immortals After Dark series by Kresley Cole. So the first season was just them reading the book and talking about each book in the series. And then in between every episode, they had like a episode about like, what's your favorite books with the favorite trope that you have. So if you're a romance fan, they really get into like why romance is so great, why like basically it's like a thesis on why romance is like changing the world. And I don't think that's a wild claim to say, but I think it's great. I definitely recommend that one. The Dream is about multi-level marketing. So it's a woman who's investigating what are some multi-level marketing, like LuLaRoe, the essential oil was one. What are other multi-level marketing? Which one?
Tupperware.
Yeah. Avon. So it goes into like in depth about like why do people still join multi-level marketing schemes? Why is it so popular with women? And it's really great. So there's 2 seasons on that one. And then another one, this is an old one, but a good one. I was surprised that Joni had never listened to it. It's S-Town, which is from the creators of Serial. But also, if you haven't listened to Serial season 1, that's a great story. But S-Town, so you go into S-Town thinking it's going to be just your usual like crime investigative podcast. And then by episode 2, it's a completely different story that I was like shocked by and like engrossed by. And some of the stats on this, like over, I think it was, Joni, do you remember, like 4 million downloads it was like millions of downloads when it released in May 2017, like millions of people were listening to it, which is incredible. And also a great story. And then I have to recommend my own podcast that I'm on. It's called Everyone and Their Sister. The reason why I got involved with the Kobo Writing Life podcast is because I had my own on the side, and we talk about books, movies, TV shows, popular culture, anything that we talk about, and we like to recommend stuff that we think other people should enjoy as well. But yeah, definitely check those out. And then, should we play this, or do we have
4 minutes? Let's see if there are questions.
Okay. If anyone has questions, please let us know. But I guess another, we do have a question. What is your favorite episode of the Cato podcast?
The same one we answered.
I would say another great one is with Christina Mendez, How to Sell Your Book Globally, because she's a CRM marketing manager for Kobo, and so she knows how to send emails to different people around the world and different ways in which you can use email newsletters to get new readers.
What's been the biggest surprise for you about making podcasts?
Me?
Yeah. What I've learned.
Do you have a answer to this one? I could give it
I think
to you.
the YouTube thing surprised me, how well we did once we started YouTube.
Yeah. I mean, it's also, I think people don't realize how much work it is.
Yeah.
It just takes a lot of, especially if you're doing a weekly, like a lot of time editing, a lot of time finding guests. But the great thing with like having two people is that I can find guests on my own and Joni can find guests on her own, and then it's double what we would want. And then also as we've grown more, people are more interested in contacting us to come on the podcast rather than us reaching out, which has been nice to see. But like one requirement for being on the podcast is that they have to publish with Kobo, that's the only requirement we have to be.
No, we've had people that don't, but they do something else, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, we do have a question. What is the funniest moment that has happened in one of your recording sessions? I have one that comes to mind. We were interviewing an author and his fire alarm went off because someone was working on his house, and then we had to pause the interview while the fire alarm was going.
It's happened. Yeah, it happened a couple times, and we've had a lot more under lockdown. We've had a lot of cats walk through, a lot of kids.
Surprise appearance from animals, yeah.
Yeah. I don't think we've had anything that crazy yet. When we do, we'll include it as a bonus.
I mean, sometimes it takes me and Joni 2 hours to record 30 seconds, just because we can't talk or we don't like what we said.
Yeah.
That's not the funniest, it's the saddest.
You should know is that you'll get very obsessive if you have to listen to your own voice, and you can re-record an infinite number of times and it'll never get better. So there's a cautionary tale.
But like after a while, once you've edited your voice 10,000 times, it doesn't bug you anymore.
Awesome. Well, that's it for questions. Thank you for listening and for coming. You can find us at the Kobo Writing Life podcast. And if you're interested in being featured, we'd love to hear from you.
If you think you want to be on the podcast, let us know at writinglife@kobo.com. We're always open to new people to talk to.
That's really cool. I think you guys do a lot of cool stuff with KWL. I know there's the blog, and then all the authors who benefit from, all the support that you guys give them. And the podcast is like really cool. So thank you so much for coming on and talking about that with us today.
Thanks for having us. It was so much fun.
I'm glad that you had fun. All right. So that concludes the Word on the Street Ideas and Imagination stream. We're still streaming on our Books and Discovery stream with more great WOTS content. Tara Henley and Kate Flanders are currently in conversation. After that panel is Ben Robinson reading from his poetry collection, Department of Continuous Improvement. At 5:45 to 6:30, Yasmin Emery will be interviewing Muhammad Ali on his new book, Angry Queer Somali Boy. And then we have our final panel, aptly named The End, that has Liz Levine, John Gould, Dakshana Baskamurti, and it is moderated by Rachel Matlow. After that, it's our final wrap-up. It's called The Afterlife. So you can join all the WOTS staff as we tell all. We will be showing you the team behind this year's festival, sharing insider details, and laughs. Come join us as we close up this 2-day festival that we've pivoted online, 3 streams, and all of them. So this stream will end. The Kids and Teens stream has already finished, and then Books and Discovery is the final one. The Word on the Street is funded in part by the Government of Canada, the Government of Ontario, and the City of Toronto. We acknowledge the support of the Canada Council for the Arts and the Ontario Arts Council, the Toronto Arts Council, and Ontario Creates. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you again soon.